You well and productive. Thank you, Brian. I was just going to ask if you could start the recording for the meeting. I'd like to call this Climate Committee's meeting to order as permitted by the Governor's Disaster Declaration of January 6, 2023. The determination has been made that an in-person meeting is not practical or prudent for this committee to meet in person. To ensure a transparent and open meeting as possible, we post the meeting materials approximately 1 week in advance and provide a recording of the meeting linked on the CMAP website, and all votes will be taken by roll call. I believe staff may have some additional virtual meeting logistical announcements before we take the roll.
Thanks, Aaron. Just mostly wanted to let everybody know that we are recording the meeting. The recording will be made available afterwards. If everyone could please remain on mute unless they have a question to ask. And if you do have a question, you can either let us know in the chat or come off mute. If a member is voting or making a motion, if you could please read your name as you make the motion so that we can record it for the minutes. We'd like to ask that anyone who has any member of the public who wants to make a comment, they can please let us know in the chat, and we will call on you at the public comment period at the end of the meeting. And I think that was all.
Thank you very much. If staff could read the roll, we can check the attendance.
Thanks. Chair Aaron Dernbaugh.
Present.
Vice Chair Deb Stone. Jack Chan.
Present.
Naomi Davis. Martha Dooley. Elena Grossman.
Present.
Cynthia Canner. Marcella Bondi-Keenan.
Present.
Elizabeth Coach.
Present.
Thomas Maillard.
Present.
Edith Macra.
Here.
Reid Mansour.
Present.
Paul May. Mary Nicol. Vanessa Ruiz. Matthew Santagata.
Present.
Jen Walling.
Present.
And Chris Young.
Present.
Great, we have a quorum.
Thank you, Brian. In the meeting invitation, you received a copy of the agenda as well as the agenda package, which includes the minutes from last meeting. Were there any changes to the agenda? Hearing none, we will move on to announcements. I will invite Deputy Executive Director Amy McEwen, who's with us today, representing CMAP, to share a few words with the committee. Amy?
Good morning. It's so nice to be here with all of you today. I'm here because Erin is in Washington, D.C. today. She is attending the National Association of Regional Councils, otherwise known as NARC. In addition, she'll be meeting with our congressional delegation as well as the administrative staff at the federal level to talk about the many priorities that this region has for transportation and infrastructure investments in Northern Illinois. We'll be providing a few announcements on her behalf, and I'm sure at your next meeting, she'll kind of share the thoughts and feedback and input she received when she was at NARC. As we start the new year, first and foremost, we want to thank each and every one of you for being a part of this committee and your willingness to contribute to the region, to the work that CMAP does on behalf of the region, and to really look at regional climate solutions going forward and how we can make progress together. So thank you very much for your willingness to serve and joining us. On the agenda today, we want to engage you in a discussion around the committee's work plan for the year. So that'll be a discussion and we're looking forward to your feedback. Our goal is to strategically plan the content so that we can truly optimize the 4 meetings that you have per year. We want to engage in meaningful ways. We want to have conversation. We want to represent diverse stakeholder groups from across the region, and then use that to influence and help to advance the region's climate work by making sure we're hearing from many voices. As a committee of the CMAP board, your value and expertise are a critical component of the overall success of the agency and of the region. We can only achieve these goals if each and every one of us is working on implementation over the 30-year period that CMAP's 2050 plan takes. So that's a lot of years, and it's a lot of steadfastness and working together on implementing, the vision that CMAP has, that the region has for climate, so that we can have an inclusive and thriving Northeastern Illinois. Couple other updates, Transportation Resilience Improvement Plan. I believe you've heard us talk about this before, but it will be on your agenda. So this will be a multi-year project seeking to understand the transportation system vulnerability to climate change and identify strategies to build resilience in the 7-county region. There are 2 key pieces for assessing the risk of our system to weather events and natural disasters, and developing an investment plan for priority projects based on the results of that assessment. This is super important because we want to make sure through this work that CMAP is doing with all of you and our other stakeholders that we meet the minimum elements of the U.S. Department of Transportation's requirements for a resilience improvement plan. By conducting this work and developing this plan with all of the implementers across the region and the various stakeholders, that will mean we're fully eligible as a region to pursue PROTECT program funding for projects and initiatives that meet those highest priorities for the region. So this will be something you'll hear about going on throughout the year. Another project you'll hear a lot about from the team is an update on work that we started with mobility recovery. So you've probably heard a few times over the last couple of years some work CMAP did on mobility recovery, and we're moving that forward in a new project or an advanced project called the Plan of Action for Regional Transit, or PART, which really just looks at what are the changes that have occurred in our region and what are the adjustments that need to occur in the transit system to make sure we have a healthy, thriving transit system that serves the people of this region. This is something that CMAP was assigned to do, directed to do by the Illinois legislature, and we're required to provide the report to them by January of next year. So Laura Wilkeson is our project manager and lead on that project, and she jokingly says you're going to hear from me about this project all year. So expect to hear more as we go through the year and updates come forward. We had our first steering committee meeting last week, which was great to meet everyone and to hear their feedback and input. And so more to come on the PART project, and we look forward to hearing from all of you as well. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Do any of the members of the committee have questions for Amy? Hearing none, thank you very much, Amy. Thank you for your comments. We will move on to our next item. So a copy, as I mentioned, a copy of the minutes from November 29, 2022 were included in the meeting packet. Were there any requested changes? Did anyone get a chance to read through and see if there were any necessary edits? Hearing none, I'll ask for a motion and a second to approve the minutes. Would a member of the committee please move to approve the minutes?
Motion.
That was Thomas Mylard who moved to approve. Could I get a second?
I second. It's Jack Chan, MWRD.
Thanks, Jack. We have a motion from Thomas and a second from Jack. If the staff could just read the roll so we could vote.
Thank you all. Chair Aaron Dernbaugh,
Approve.
Vice Chair Deborah Stone, Jack Chan,
Approve.
Naomi Davis, Martha Dooley, Elena Grossman, Cynthia Canner, Marcella Keenan,
Approve.
Elizabeth Coach,
Approve.
Thomas Maylard,
Approve.
Edith McRae,
Approve.
Raid Mansour,
Approve.
Paul May, Mary Nickel, Vanessa Ruiz, Matthew Santagata,
Approve.
Jen Walling,
Approve.
and Chris Young.
Approve.
The motion carries.
Thank you very much. We will, and thank you for the staff for taking such good minutes and reminding us of the discussion and decisions we make. We'll move on to new business. This is agenda item 4.01, which will be a presentation from Bill Barnes on this year's work plan for this committee. Bill is the interim deputy for regional policy and implementation, and following a presentation, we'll have a discussion.
Thanks, Chairman. I actually believe Brian and Jamie are going to lead this discussion to start with, and then I'll follow up with some comments.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Well, I guess I'll start. We wanted to revisit the Climate Committee work plan for FY23, which we discussed in part in November. So thank you to everyone for your feedback. We had a really constructive discussion about that in November. And we'll talk a little bit more about how some of the kind of more conceptual items are getting worked into the work plan for the committee and for CMAP as a whole. As far as the sort of structure of the meetings for 2023, we're going to stick with something resembling what we did last year, which is that each quarterly meeting will have a theme that's related to one of the sort of components of our strategic vision on our climate work at CMAP. There are 3 of those, and there are 4 quarters in the year. So the first meeting is more of an overview of the work to come and the overall work plan. And then the second quarter, we'll be talking about mitigation. The third in July, we'll be talking about resilience. And in the fourth quarter, we'll be talking about water. Now, as with last year, these themes are not meant to be rigid. We will be bringing you the work that is timely to discuss at the points in the year where it makes the most sense. But we will have a sort of kind of main presentation and discussion, mostly discussion with you about each of these themes at the appropriate meeting. So for example, you'll be hearing more about some of the resilience work that we're doing today, but we'll also be talking about resilience in July. Things like the PART project, you can expect to hear about regularly throughout the year. But for those of you who are interested in, one of these topics first and foremost, you can see that we have them laid out in this pattern for the year. So thank you for your feedback. It sounded like having some kind of a theme to the meetings was something that people appreciated last year. So we wanted to stick with that.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And what I want to talk about again is, my name's Bill Barnes. I'm the interim deputy of regional planning and implementation. And at the top of the slide here, it talks about the evolving role of the committee and enhanced engagement. And I just sort of want to amplify some of the messages that Amy spoke to at the beginning of this, which is CMAP's ongoing efforts to improve the way it leverages the expertise represented on its various committees, specifically the climate committee, which is convened here today. We recognize what you as committee members bring to the table. Each of you has personal and professional subject matter expertise in areas that have direct links to the work that we do in the climate arena. And it's not just the personal and subject matter expertise that you bring, but each of you represents unique communities, professions, constituencies who have voices, opinions, and priorities on many of the topics that we're working on and that we're going to be presenting on during our committee meetings. We only have 4 committee meetings a year, so we need to be very mindful of the way that we bring information to you. So frequently we ask your priorities in the climate space. What is important to you? What is important to the people or the communities that you represent? What are you hearing? And believe it or not, we've heard you. We've taken those priorities to heart, and as part of the annual budget work plan process, we are preparing as an agency a budget and a work plan which specifies the projects and the programs that are going to be implemented or continued during fiscal year 24. And once those budget and work plan are finalized and approved by the board, we intend to come to you once, if not more, over the course of this upcoming year and draw direct lines between the priorities you have identified and the work that is being continued, initiated at CMAP. And So not only do we want to demonstrate to you the link, the causality between your engagement and the work that we're doing, we want to enhance the way that we engage with you on a quarterly basis. In the past, we've largely reported out to you on all the great work that we have accomplished. And we're going to continue to come to you and apprise you of our work and our successes, but more often with an eye towards the future. If we're presenting findings to you, it's our goal to work with you to solicit your thoughts and opinions. How would you or your constituents use the tool or the database that we developed? How can we help you, or how can you help us prioritize options for implementation? If we're scoping out a new project or a program, of the options that we're considering, how would you prioritize them? What's important to you? And that might help us frame the arc of that program or the project. How can we best use our various levers of implementation to affect a desired change? What is the most effective way to implement or operationalize the work that we're doing? So to ensure robust discussion moving forward, it's our goal that we're going to get you discussion questions in advance of our meetings so that you have time to consider them, think them through, and that when we come to the point in the presentations or in the meeting, you know, you've had the ability, the time and the ability to put some thought into it and have some truly engaging conversations. Not that conversations in the past haven't been engaging, but we want to make sure that we're maximizing your time and making sure that we're getting the most out of you. It's important to note that this is a two-way street. We want your input, but we also want your output. Each of you, I see you as an ambassador for CMAP's work, climate or otherwise. Each of you is a valued and trusted source for various audiences, communities, and the like. Working together, it's my hope that we can find where each of you are best positioned to spread the word about what we're doing. With whom can you share our success? How can CMAP harness your relationships, professional or personal, to increase our outreach and advocacy? So moving forward, my ask to each and every one of you is that as we present to you over the course of the next year, is to consider how you or your organization can amplify our success. If we don't ask you, please volunteer. But think about ways where you can take the work that we're doing, the questions that we're asking, and pushing them out to your constituents or the folks that you represent. If you need us to come in to your community or speak to your constituents or the folks that you represent, we're more than happy to do so. So ultimately, the goal is to ensure that it's a two-way street, and that as we move into the future, we're always looking to the future. We're always going to look at our past successes, but we want to leverage those successes. We want to make sure that you are helping us to where there are inflection points, where there are decision points, giving us priorities, giving us your opinions so they can influence the work that we're doing so that we can do the best we possibly can within the climate space. That is the vision right now of the evolving role of the committee and the sort of enhanced engagement that we seek to achieve moving forward.
Thank you, Bill. Do any members of the committee have any questions for Bill or CMAP staff, either on the work plan or any of the remarks that Bill just shared? I guess not. If anybody, it sounds like that was a very direct invitation to us to follow up. Should you have any additional thoughts or questions on what that means or how best this committee can both serve and inform CMAP's work. So if something comes to you, either as other discussions are taking place today or following the meeting, or if you see other information coming from CMAP that you think has a specific climate connection, feel free, I think, to reach out to Bill or Brian or Jamie or probably any of the CMAP staff. So maybe I'll extend that invitation on behalf of CMAP. So anything else before we move on to the next agenda item? Brian, Bill, Jamie? No? Okay. Fair warning, I gave you the committee members enough time to ask questions. Moving on to item 4.02. This is, as Amy mentioned, the agency's mobility recovery project to inform the transit system report. So I believe we'll get a little bit of a presentation here. It looks like, Bill, you're up again to provide the committee an update on this project, which we'll be hearing about across the year.
I am. Thank you, Chair. And while Amy promised Laura Wilkinson, I'm her surrogate for today and possibly moving forward. So we just have a brief presentation. Is this the PowerPoint, Brian?
Yes, this should be it.
Okay. So as noted, as Amy indicated, as was presented to this group in November, CMAP has been tasked by the General Assembly to solve a very vexing problem that is facing mass transit in northeastern Illinois. There is a operational budget shortfall on an annual basis of over $700 million, $730 million that needs to be solved. And the problems that CMAP faces isn't just the financial aspect, but it's also taking a look at, how can transit in the northeastern Illinois region be improved so that it's sustainable fiscally and from a ridership standpoint. So recap, we all know why transit's important. Obviously, there's the direct nexus to climate. The more transit is used, the less single-use cars are on the roads, and greenhouse gases, emissions can be reduced. But transit also enhances mobility in and around our communities for riders and non-riders alike. The more folks that are on transit aren't in cars, and congestion is reduced. Transit also fosters a vibrant and connected regional economy. We all know that when people have mobility and are able to have access to the places where they want to go, the places where they want to shop, it drives the economy, and it's a very important part to the regional economy that we have. And transit, as indicated, we have a direct nexus to the climate and greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. So it's a fiscal cliff, and the fiscal cliff is driven by a number of factors, namely a decrease in ridership during the pandemic, ridership levels that have not returned to pre-pandemic levels. So with a decrease in fares, the operating budget is experiencing a shortfall to the tune of, as I indicated, $730 million a year. That $730 million is slated to grow every year, and that gap has currently been made up with federal dollars. Those federal dollars are slated to run out in totality by 2026, but we're going to start to see shortfalls in 2025, meaning the General Assembly needs to act in 2024. Failure to fill that gap will cause drastic cuts in service, which we'll look at in a future slide, will create what's known as the death spiral, which will drive ridership down and cause irreparable damage to the transit system. Next slide. So here, transit system can't solve things alone. They can't cut their way out of this. They can't increase fares to get out of this, because that's going to drive a decrease in custom transit services, causes decreased ridership, causes decreased revenues, causes transit cuts, and it's a feedback loop that continues and continues until there's nothing left. So the General Assembly mandated that CMAP take a look at this problem, and it specifically required that we focus on financial viability. We need to make sure that transit in northeastern Illinois is fiscally sustainable today and long into the future. And that requires taking a look at a comprehensive and coordinated system. So it's not just fiscal viability, but it's a system that people choose, prioritize as a source of mobility. And in doing so, there are a number of factors that have to be taken into consideration: safety, security, cleanliness, efficacy, all issues that riders have identified as barriers to them taking transit. And then we also need to take a look at, much in line with CMAP and its mission, how does efficient land use drive transit ridership? Considerations, the lenses that we need to view potential solutions: racial equity, climate change, economic development, and then as mandated by the legislature, we're required, and necessarily we should, build on all the good work that RTA has done in its strategic planning efforts. If you haven't seen it already, the 2023 Transit is the Answer draft strategic plan is out, and it is a very thoughtful study of the current situation. We are also required to consider certain mechanisms for ensuring the viability of transit. Taking a look at the recovery ratio, which is the legislative mandate that a certain percentage of the operating expenses of transit be made up by fares. Take a look at sales tax reforms, both increasing the base or increasing the rate. Looking at governance structures, how is transit governed with the RTA and the various independent service boards? How are the monies received and dispersed amongst RTA and the various service boards? The General Assembly has asked us to take a look at that and consider improvements to same. Regional fare systems, how can we implement that to limit or remove or minimize barriers to riding transit throughout the region? And then there's my favorite, any other changes that we see fit, sort of a catch-all. What can we do to effectuate change and prioritize transit? Next, please. So the timeline is ambitious. We launched the steering committee just this month, January 18th, and we have until January 1, 2024 to put together a comprehensive report that not only solves the fiscal situation, but also envisions an improved transit system, one which, as I indicated, will be prioritized by riders throughout the region and chosen as their first mode of transport. So we will be discussing and developing recommendations until through the summer. We're going to be refining those in late summer. The board and the MPO policy committee is directed by statute to approve this report. So the work we are doing is done through the lens that there is necessary approval by the board and the MPO policy committee, with recommendations finally going to the General Assembly in January of 2024. Next, please. Action shot. Carol Brown, former head of CTA, now with PNC Bank. She and Randy Blankenhorn are heading up the section that is looking at how to implement the system that we want, which takes a look at governance. Next, please. Another action shot. This is the steering committee in their entirety, and there's a handsome man addressing them, talking about the aspect of the work that's taking a look at how to pay for this. We have three groups we have three main focus areas. One is, what is the system that we want? What does it look like? That's the regional fare aspects. That's taking a look at reduced fares. That's taking a look at safety. That's taking a look at cleanliness and efficiency. Then we have to pay for that. What are the mechanisms that we need to leverage in order to generate the revenues or the cuts and the savings necessary to reduce or eliminate that budget shortfall? And then there's the governance. How do we implement that? What does it look like? Next slide, please. There are a couple of principles that are guiding the work that we're doing. Focusing on ensuring the system is financially viable in 2026 and beyond. That's the most imminent challenge we have. This fiscal cliff will be felt in its entirety come 2026. So we need to have a plan in place now. We need to be working towards implementing that plan now so that we have funding in place before federal funds run out in 2026. Identify recommendations where the state has a role in implementing solutions. The recipient of this report is the General Assembly. We need to identify solutions that the state can effectuate. These are solutions that are within the purview of the legislature. That's not to say that the transit boards don't have skin in the game. They recognize that savings and efficiencies need to be achieved at their level, and they're working on that. But our report is specifically to the General Assembly, so we need to identify solutions that on which the state can act. We need to rebuild a system that's stronger than it was before COVID-19. We don't want to go back to the status quo. Now is the time to think great thoughts. How can we envision a transit system that is prioritized by riders around the region? What does that take? What does that mean? And then again, how do we implement it? And then how do we pay for it? And then finally, or not finally, center users of the system. The riders are key. We're not doing this for transit's sake. We're doing this because there are riders around the region that rely upon transit to get to work, to get to play, to get to the hospital, to see loved ones. That's the reason transit exists. And we need to center all of our solutions around the fact that we're not doing it just to have a bunch of trains and buses driving around. We're doing it to serve the residents of the region and visitors to this region as well. And finally, be bold. We've been told by many members of the steering committee that, yeah, we've been through this exercise before, but this time is different. This time is the opportunity to think the great thoughts, be transformative, and come up with a plan to implement them. Next, please. Again, like I said, we have broken our focus areas into three. The system we want, which is what is the ideal transit system in Northeastern Illinois look like? How do we pay for it? Those are the funding mechanisms and the efficiencies and cost reductions that are necessary to buy down that $730 million operating gap. And then how to implement it. This is the governance. This is the recommendations for how transit is organized, how funding is allocated, and performance metrics that are assigned to funding, which are so important to the audiences to which we are speaking. Next, please. So what are we talking about? We're talking about increased ridership. We're talking about improving the user experience. We're talking about bending the cost curve, creating those efficiencies, creating cost savings. So again, when we're talking about the system that we're looking for, the penultimate transit system, we're looking at safety and security. We're taking a look at bus priority. Given the role of buses and operating costs, how can we prioritize them as a transit option throughout the region? Fare integration, regional rail, making better use of the assets that we have throughout the region, and then thinking about the land use changes that can enhance what we already have. ADA, we're making progress on this crucial topic in all aspects of what CMAP's doing, but we're building on this recent regional progress and leveraging new federal funds to enhance and encourage accessibility to and on our transit systems. So, when we're taking a look at the system we want, it's important to know that topics that have been raised in this various committee about electrification of buses are very important. And these are topics that are directly within the purview of the transit agency. As I indicated, this report has one audience and one audience alone. That's the General Assembly. And the General Assembly, we need to give them solutions on which they can act independently. That's not to say that many of the solutions that have been raised within this group aren't under consideration at the CTA, at PACE, and at RTA, and under consideration in consultation with CMAP. We're working with them to identify these efficiencies, but our immediate focus is going to be on strategies that can be responsive to this near-term fiscal crisis. It's also important to note that we're not using this forum to plan for system expansions. There's been much talk about a metro line out to Kendall County. Frankly, you can't expand a system that doesn't exist. We need to focus on the current challenge, which is ensuring the fiscal and financial sustainability of the system. Some improvements may be taken into consideration to the extent that it's implementing some of the improvements that are recommended by this process, or to effectuate some of the efficiencies or cost savings that are identified through this process. Next, please. So we got some discussion points here, sort of riffing on what we had talked about back in November. Back in November, we'd sort of focused on, you know, a nexus to climate change. But here we want to talk about, you know, inducing a mode shift. How can we begin to focus people on transit as an option? So inducing mode shift towards transit is critical to the region's climate and emissions goal. With that in mind, what are your reactions to the objectives and issues identified in the system we want? So the system we want, that's talking about safety and security, talking about bus priority, talking about fare integration, regional rail, ADA, and the like. Are there any, is there an aspect to the system that we want? Is there a focus area that we're missing? Is there something that we should be taking under consideration and prioritizing given your climate lens?
Do any members of the committee have any reaction to that question or any questions based on Bill's presentation? I guess I have an initial one, which sort of is a response to your question, Bill. Is the financial risk or financial exposure of fossil fuels for, you know, diesel, which is, you know, a big part of both the Metro and CTA and PACE fleets, and what we just saw last summer with the increased cost of fuels, and is that either being studied as an experience towards informing, if so much of this is sort of financially kind of driven towards not just new revenue, but also expense control and risk mitigation? Is that being included or considered?
It's not being considered. It's not being considered at this level. But you know, that is something that's well within the purview of the transit agencies themselves. And I know that there are solutions for that. And you don't want to hear this, but buying in bulk. You know, having a single contract for fuel, and buying in bulk, you get reduced, you know, reduced prices, and you know, you can bend the cost curve there. The biggest cost right now, frankly, is in the labor. You know, that is one of the driving forces that are pushing operating costs up. I know that, you know, as has been discussed here, bus electrification is under consideration. There are commitments by the various transit agencies to meet certain goals, and that's going to, you know, reduce reliance on fossil fuels and cut into those costs. But frankly, those types of solutions are solely within the purview of the transit agencies themselves. We'll work with them to influence and encourage, but at this macro level, Aaron, we're not looking at individual systematic changes. We're looking at, you know, how can we improve the system without major capital investments.
Thanks. Other
Okay,
members?
this is
Go ahead, Marcella.
Yeah, this is Marcella. So, Bill, I think that your statements are correct in terms of the objectives and the issues. I would say that from my perspective as a commuter in Chicago and someone who's ridden it for decades now. I would say that the, public confidence is key. To me, that might be the driver along with the reliability of the service. I think transit honestly has a fair amount of, I would say, captive riders in a sense. I mean, there are people like me who rely on it. I do not have another way to work affordably in any sense of the word. So I guess I question a little bit the driver between fare integration and affordability. Of course, there will always be people who need affordable transit more so than whatever the baseline is. And I think we have programs for that we can continue. But, this is not necessarily my area of expertise. So I will leave that to you. But I guess I would say that I find that the RTA system be pretty affordable as it is. And I could, in other cities, it's less so. And, it is a necessary service for me. To your other question, ADA accessibility, absolutely. It is a little ridiculous that there are still so many stations, like 50 some years after the ADA was passed, that are just inaccessible. And honestly, it's not an acceptable way of being. So to me, it seems like that honestly is a grant opportunity right there. If you can tie in your ADA accessibility goals with just your general need for all of these other things, it's a win for everybody. And in terms of, absolutely, there's ways to integrate transportation with climate and resiliency funds. Us climate folks have been saying that for years because transportation historically has been the big pot of money and we've been sort of the little ones looking for dollars. So I would say, if you are considering electrification as a way to increase bus service or public confidence, definitely there's a federal priority on that, fleet electrification. I would say that the diesel run trains are going to be a challenge unless you're looking at converting them or something. But anywhere you can electrify your fleet, absolutely, there is money out there.
Good points, all good points. And, to the ADA accessibility and the CTA, I'm thinking back to a release I saw. I think there's a commitment to making a number of their stations accessible within the coming years in their capital program. So there's a focus there. And yes, 50 years is way too long.
I believe Thomas had a question or a
Yeah,
comment.
again, I appreciate your report in jumping on or agreeing with previous commenters. I would at least push back on the sentiment of without capital investments. I think that is difficult to envision, seeing some of the lapses in things in comfortability in sort of the RTA's ridership, lack of bus shelters, lack of it was pulling teeth to get heat lamps up in Waukegan for many years. These are I can't imagine trying to convey to a potential rider to use these services and wait for these services in winter months with some of those lack of basic amenities of protection from the elements. Further, I think in terms of partnering with maybe other agencies that aren't just transportation necessarily minded, but transit-oriented development. Certainly, I think we can all point to a number of our communities that have opportunities for growth for living accommodations near some of these pickup points that are yet to be developed. And proximity to stations clearly is a major factor. Proximity to bus pick stops is a major factor in people's use of it.
So a couple of things to unpack there. Thank you very much for that comment. So, when I said no capital investments, we just have to be very careful about capital investments. We can't solve all the capital needs of the system. To the extent that there are improvements identified that can increase ridership. So to your point, Tom, bus shelters, heat lamps, if there are improvements that we need to create efficiencies and to encourage ridership, I don't see those as being off the table. It's massive increases in service, creating new lines to new counties. So those, that's a bridge too far, at least at this initial setting. TOD is, so I am heading up the group that is looking at funding solutions, and TOD is something that is very high on our list of worth considering. We need to take a look into this. And then all of the property related dollars that can be generated from developers who seize on the opportunities near transit and in and around transit hubs. So those are longer term solutions, and we're coming up with short, medium, long-term solutions. Nothing's off the table right now, but I appreciate it. Very thoughtful. Thank you.
There was a question in the chat from committee member Chris Young. Chris, I don't know if you wanted to come off mute and ask it, or if you'd like, I can ask it, I suppose. It says, does the shift to remote work create a barrier to shifting back to pre-pandemic writing habits?
It does. We continue to study the trends in hybrid and remote work. And, there are a number of studies out there that range in estimates as to what it's going to look like in 2, 5, 7, 10 years, and what's the total amount of folks that are going to be traveling back. And that's a challenge that the transit agencies need to wrestle with. And it's something that is built into this effort to the extent that efficiencies can be created by adjusting service to meet the new fluid demands of the workforce. Studies show that ridership is down on Wednesdays and Fridays, but up on Tuesdays through Thursday. So maybe you increase service during those 3 days and reduce service on Monday and Friday, creating savings. So it's a challenge. I think I answered that question. I'm going to pull it up. Yes. So yes, I think I answered that. And then going to have to rethink the fare box relationship along with urban congestion pricing. Again, those are all funding solutions that are on the table for consideration.
So any other questions or comments from the committee? I may have just one more before. Oh, so when I started working here at Loyola, we had just been part of a large employer commuter options program. And so there were a number of programs as a large regional employer that were available to employees and were recommendations. Is that type of support for large employers still exist? That type of relationship, both in a way to drive support to the transit system, but also to these folks who want to make these systems work for themselves and for their employees, and all the different kinds of resources that are available, pre-tax transit and discounted fare cards, things like that. Is that something that could be packaged into a legislative recommendation through this kind of effort? Something that's focused not on your normal target audience, municipalities and counties and units of government, but to the folks that most of us actually deal with most directly, our employers, as we're commuting to and from work.
So great question. And, I know that pre-tax, transit benefits remain available. And as part of this steering committee, as part of this group that we have been required by legislation to bring together, the business community has a seat at the table. Not only because they may bear the brunt of any sales tax increases that might come about, but also it's their employees that have to get in and out of the city or wherever they're located. So they are an important voice in this process. And they, as I've seen already, are willing to advocate on behalf of their employees to make sure that any barriers to getting in and out of work on mass transit are are reduced as much as possible. And whether or not that's something that can be baked in or it can be mandated by the legislature, I don't know. But I do know that every single funding solution is on the table right now. It will be slowly winnowed down and prioritized. And that's the type of conversation that I expect to be having with you in Q2, 3, and 4 as this process evolves.
Thanks, Bill. Well, I think we'll move on to the next agenda item.
Yeah.
Unless there's no other comments or, yep.
Yeah, we could, there's just a couple of slides, you know.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
But here, we can just go back up so go to the steering committee. Again, I mentioned, so this is the outreach that we're doing. And, you know, it's just this type of a meeting is you know, evidence of the level of detail that we want to give to our stakeholders, the level of feedback that we want to get back, that we want to take back to the discussion groups and the steering committee. It's at all levels of government and then all levels of the community. We're using all the levers that we have at CMAP to engage. Next slide. The steering committee was largely set forth within the in the statute, involves environmental, involves community, business, local, private, you name it. We try to be as comprehensive as possible, to have as many voices at the table, so that recognizing that not only does this package need to pass through the board and the MPO policy committee, but also needs to be passed or acted upon by the legislature, the state legislature. So it needs to be nuanced and inclusive. Next steps, we're going to continue to meet with stakeholders. We're preparing for a second steering committee meeting, which is, I believe, in March. And we're working on responses from the public opinion survey that CMAP is issuing, again, as a further layer of engagement. There's going to be a lot of research done. Papers are going to be written to inform the decisions of the steering committee, and we'll support the recommendations that are ultimately made to the legislature. And then finally, as common sense indicates and is required by the statute, we have to continue to coordinate with the RTA. It would be senseless to be you know, at odds with them, and they're informing us and working with us at every step. Next, and then just team leadership, Laura, as Amy indicated, Amy Lee, a deputy of transportation, myself, Elizabeth, and Daniel. And with that, why don't we move on to the next agenda item? I don't want to take any more from it, but you will be seeing me in future quarters, I promise.
Thank you very much. And there was one other comment from committee member Martha Dooley in the chat about the EECBG funding for transportation. So,
Yeah, thank you.
Yep. All right. We are moving on to item 4.03. The next item is a presentation on the Transportation Resilience Improvement Plan. And it looks like Kate Avasic will provide an overview of this multi-year project and lead the discussion. Kate, take it away.
Thank you, Chair Dernbaugh. Good morning, everyone. So I'm back to present on some of our resilience work. You may recall that in July, I gave you an overview of our resilience work in general. And so today I'm here to really take a deeper dive into our transportation resilience projects and hopefully have a discussion with you on how we can strengthen this work. So over the course of the presentation, I'm going to talk about where we've been, what we've been doing currently, and then where we're headed. So on the next slide, first where we've been, you know, looking back at our early resilience work, going back before CMAP was established, the Northeastern Illinois Planning Commission helped build resilience by developing model stormwater ordinances focused on improving water quality and reducing flooding. And NIPSI also developed a strategic plan for water resources management that really looked at stormwater and flooding, water quality, water supplies, water resources as a whole, and the intersection between those core areas. CMAP's early work, of course, in terms of Go to 2040, really focused on stormwater and flooding with respect to riverine or overbank flooding. And so that was included in that first regional comprehensive plan. Of course, following the storms of April 2013 that caused extensive flooding in the region, especially urban flooding, CMAP received CDBG disaster recovery funds, as well as funds from the MacArthur Foundation, to really develop some planning tools like the Flood Susceptibility Index and other guidance to help address flooding and stormwater needs in our local planning projects. And this work was really informed by some studies that had taken place during this time, including by C&T and IDNR. And ultimately, this work informed Onto 2050, which has recommendations to plan for climate change and protect people and assets from flooding, including a strong emphasis on increasing the resilience of the transportation system. Next slide, please. One of our recent projects focused on transportation resilience was with the Central Council of Mayors. So through our technical assistance program, we contracted with Gawalt Hamilton Associates to work on the Central Council, or to work with the Central Council to develop a transportation resilience plan that was focused on flooding. First, just a little bit of info on the Central Council of Mayors. It's an organization of 15 municipalities in West Cook County that provides input into regional transportation policy decisions, communicates within the municipalities and, between the municipalities and CMAP, and establishes priorities for allocating the local surface transportation program, or the STPL. We have 11 of these sub-councils of mayors across Northeastern Illinois. Next slide. Back in 2019, the Central Council completed a transportation plan that was really focused on identifying some larger regional projects for the STP Shared Fund, as well as smaller local transportation needs. Just a bit of info on the STP Shared Fund. This was established after the adoption of Onto 2050 to fund regional projects that meet the goals of the plan. CMAP just updated the project selection criteria for the shared fund to include a resilience planning factor, which is really to encourage the adoption of resilience practices within the proposed projects, as well as adopting different policies at the local level. Understanding the severe impact that flooding has had on the system, and with that scoring criteria in mind, the Central Council applied for assistance to build on this plan and really create a companion plan focused on flood resilience. The goal of the project is to develop a plan to reduce the flood risk of the transportation system within the Central Council region. This is the first of its kind within our region, and to achieve the goal, we identified these 5 objectives. First, assessing the vulnerability of the system to flooding, identifying where these flooding issues coincide with known transportation priorities or planned projects on the books, engaging communities and the many partners involved in transportation and stormwater flood mitigation decision-making, including MWRD, Cook County, IDOT, developing a plan that outlines priorities and policies and other areas for study. This definitely was a high-level view. And then finally, to leverage all of the work that's been done underway, or that is underway, and help guide and coordinate investment decisions in the region. So throughout the vulnerability assessment, we mapped low spots within the street rights of way where flooding could occur. We then ranked these areas based on several factors, including if there was known flooding, the use of the street in terms of traffic counts, access to train and bus service, and also access to critical facilities like hospitals and others. We mapped 700 locations, and then we narrowed that list down to 56 critical locations. On the next slide, I have a map that really was our attempt to understand some of the future impacts from climate change. We know that our infrastructure isn't sized to handle the storms that we're receiving today, let alone the storms that we're going to see in the future. So on this map, it may be a little hard to see, but the purple locations are the areas that are currently at risk and were scored, as I just described. But then we expanded those areas that's shown in blue, and these are really seen as anticipated at-risk locations due to more intense rainfall. Finally, on the next slide, we worked with communities to narrow in on 21 project locations. We wanted to make sure each community had a project, and in certain communities, more than one project really came to light. So we identified these project locations and developed some high-level project summaries that could be used to seek grant funding, especially right now, or the MWRD, I should say, recently closed their call, I believe, for projects. But these project summaries provided all of the necessary information for certain communities to apply for those funds. On the next slide, I just wanted to touch on that. In addition to the capital project needs, the plan also touches on operational and policy recommendations. I would say of particular interest to some of the towns was to coordinate detour routes for major roadways, both among themselves and within with PACE and CTA, Cook County, and IDOT. That's currently not taking place. The plan was adopted by the Central Council just last month. There are some near-term steps for implementation, and these include really pursuing the priority projects and engaging the communities in the project development process. Using the current and future vulnerability scores to inform project selection for the STP shared fund, for the STPL or local funds, as well as municipal capital improvement plans, and also convening stakeholders to discuss detour route planning and coordination within the council. So one of the reasons why CMAP was interested to take on this project was the opportunity for it to really serve as a pilot for our regional transportation improvement plan. The scale of this project is different. We were looking at 15 communities and there were challenges associated with that, but there were some good lessons learned that can help inform our regional work. So first, flooding data, going into this, we knew this, but it's limited, and it really highlights the importance of engagement or process to collect that data in some way, and using proxy data to get at potential risk areas. We're not going to be able to identify them all. Really the data is limited because it's collected by many different entities. And, when you're responding to a flood, the last thing that you have time for is to, open up an app or, take note of the flooding location. So it just doesn't happen in some cases. Another lesson learned has to do with O&M needs related to responding to flood challenges, such as alert and warning systems, reroutes, and the coordination that's really necessary but lacking. We also know that transportation flooding is not always isolated. It can be, of course, in the case of a flooded underpass, but in many cases, and we heard this through the Central Council project, if a street is flooded, so too are the surrounding properties. So while there's value in ranking transportation-related problem areas over others, oftentimes the solutions will really require a more holistic assessment to resolve all the parts of the problem. And then lastly, related to that, many transportation-related problems, flooding problems, involve multiple transportation, stormwater jurisdictions at the municipal, county, state levels, and oftentimes these problems are just too big for a municipality to resolve on their own. And the funding required can be significant, creating a need to really cobble together many different sources. So looking ahead at our transportation resilience work, I want to focus on the Transportation Resilience Improvement Plan. And this is a significant project that's going to help us access federal dollars for resilience improvements. It'll help us integrate resilience into CMAP's core transportation functions and really help direct our resilience work for years to come. The objective of this project is to develop a data-driven understanding of system vulnerability to climate change and extreme weather, identify priority investments across the region, and finally, to support integrating climate change or climate resilience into transportation management and investment decisions. And to do that, we're going to be engaging transportation implementers, as well as those with emergency management and stormwater authority. We're dividing this project into two phases. The first phase is to conduct the vulnerability assessment. And this will take place, I'll say roughly from March when we kick off and until about June of 2024. And then the second phase is to develop the resilience improvement plan. We expect this to take place starting next spring and be completed by the end of June 2025. So the regional assessment will differ from the Central Council project in that it's looking at all natural hazards, not just flooding. or I should say a subset of natural hazards. The first step of the assessment is really for us to look system-wide to broadly understand which assets and hazards to assess further by looking at the general vulnerability of transportation assets to different hazards. So you can see in the example table here, and this is just an example because we haven't done this work yet, that we rank the asset groups in terms of having high, medium, and low vulnerability to different climate hazards. And then the second step is more targeted. And here we're focused on an asset level analysis to identify priority locations for resilience improvements. So we'll take a deep dive into the assets and the hazards that are flagged as high in step 1, and then go through the process like we did in the Central Council project to rank individual assets like road segments or train stations based on their vulnerability to these different hazards. We expect the assessment to cover both roadway and transit systems and to evaluate vulnerability to the hazards that are listed here. The level of detail is really going to come down to data availability, but we know through some scoping workshops that we held earlier last year that these assets and hazards are really of interest to stakeholders. And so these are the ones that we know we at least want to examine at that high level to begin with. So the assessment will also do a few more things. It'll look at extreme heat impacts to transit riders. So it'll look at different factors that can contribute to disparate impacts. We expect to leverage the work that CMAP's currently doing to develop a heat vulnerability index, as well as the work that's happening in the region to develop other indices and use those in this study. And finally, the result of this work could identify portions of bus or train lines or stops that service more vulnerable riders and therefore could be prioritized for investments like shelter, increased service frequency, or additional service lines. The assessment will also seek to quantify the economic impacts of transportation flooding, including costs to related user delays, revenue losses for CTA and PACE, which has already been calculated through a plan from the RTA, as well as equity impacts to see, whether or not historically disinvested and marginalized communities are burdened the most by these major flooding transportation impacts. The assessment will be folded then into the transportation improvement plan. That'll really help CMAP, help us with our internal planning and decision-making, as well as hopefully other transportation implementers in the region. It'll ensure that the region is eligible and competitive for PROTECT program, the discretionary funds or the grant funds in particular, as well as other funding opportunities through other sources, such as FEMA's BRIC program and others. And then finally, the development of this plan is relatively new, or I should say pretty new, for MPOs and state DOTs to take on. So we want to learn from what they're doing to see what we can adopt for our region. So to help to do this, the plan's going to outline resilience strategies and project types, an investment plan of priority projects across the region, as well as opportunities to integrate resilience into transportation decision-making, from influencing the selection of performance measures, design guidelines, other policies, and asset management. And then finally, we expect to engage many different stakeholders throughout the entire project. And our first step really is to develop an outreach plan. We'll be consulting with CMAP staff and others, including the recently formed Community Alliance for Regional Equity, to determine what methods we use, who the potential stakeholders or audience are, and what are those touch points for engagement, so that we're really getting meaningful information. I think we don't want to limit the engagement, but at the same time, and this sort of feeds into my first question, is like, at what level is needed? How do we really go about this for such a regional project? So that concludes my presentation. I have 4 discussion questions that I'm hoping to get through, but I understand that we may not have the time for all of them. But so thank you. And really the first one is focused on engagement.
Thank you,
So
Kate.
I can ask that if you'd like, Chair Dernbaugh.
Sure, or I can invite members of the committee if you'd like to respond to this question. I think it's on the slide, but currently the project envisions engagement with primary implementing and advising bodies, including the Community Alliance for Regional Equity. Are there additional stakeholders that you believe should be included in CMAP's outreach efforts? And I guess as part of this question, how would the climate committee be engaged as a stakeholder in the process? So any members of the committee like to respond to that, or you can raise your hand or just come off mute.
Okay, so there's no other community groups. I'm sorry, I think I might not be remembering all of the list of implementing and advising bodies. Are there, what are the community groups that are included?
So at a minimum, we would be working with the community groups that are part of the Community Alliance for Regional Equity. I think from there, we certainly can do more. We can have focus groups or interviews with community groups that are interested in participating. You know, public meetings are also not off the table. So I think, yeah,
Okay.
at a minimum, those that are working within CARE.
Got it. I'm just, do you have your, I just looked up the cohort. Okay. So, I do feel like there's probably some missing people here. Most of whom are in the Chicago EJ network.
Okay.
I would say that El Vejo is getting more involved with transportation in general.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Marcella.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, go ahead, Edith.
For that. So these might be really obvious, but the COGs and then the transportation committees with the COGs would be really good stakeholders for this. And then for, you know, to get diversity across the region, I'd encourage engagement with the municipal commissions. And there are sometimes transportation commissions, sometimes sustainability commissions, traffic safety commissions. But I think that's a good way to get additional citizen involvement just beyond working with municipal staff.
Great, thanks for that, Edith.
And then I guess one more thought, just to echo what Thomas Maylard was it? No, I'm sorry, it was Aaron talking about the commuter options program that engaged with large employers. Is that something that also maybe revisiting that network of large employers for input could be very valuable as well? And I also have to say, just while I have the mic, this is terrific work. I'm really glad to see it at CMAP undertaking this. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you.
This is a question that is sort of inspired by your question about stakeholders, but when you're looking at transportation, that's what's in the scope, I guess. What transportation infrastructure is in the scope of what you're considering? I might have missed that, but I guess I'm thinking of the different transportation constituencies. Certainly there's transit riders, there's roadway, highway, fleet managers, but also biking and pedestrian, you know, sort of in that infrastructure. Those could each then inform stakeholder groups depending on what's in scope. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we are including transit. We are including bike ped within the right of way. We decided to not include any regional trails that are, you know, not within the right of way. for the purpose of this initial assessment, but that could be something that we look at in the future.
I just know as a seasonal bike commuter that after storms and weather, bike trails and lanes, whether they're on the right of way and they're protected or they're on an off-road trail, can often be some of the last things to get serviced and can be quite inconveniencing. And then for anybody who hasn't seen the footage of the bikers on the lakefront path down there by Oak Street curve getting wiped out by waves off of Lake Michigan as they try and get to work, that's some compelling footage of why it's difficult to be a bike commuter during bad weather. Anyway, other comments from the committee to this question about stakeholders? Kate, do you have another, maybe,
Yeah,
is there
I think
another
we can
question?
move on. Yeah. And maybe I would preface this one with, you know, some of what we learned from the Central Council project and know from other work is really that building resilience to flooding, heat, and other hazards is really going to require solutions that really look beyond transportation infrastructure to consider land use and other non-transportation projects that can support broader resilience, community resilience needs. So, you know, here the question is, what opportunities do you see for us to use this project to really help frame and support both our larger resilience program and our ability to develop data and best practices and policy for non-transportation work?
Go ahead, Edith.
Yeah, thanks for that. I was going to raise my hand. I didn't get that fast. But I just wanted to point out that the climate action plan for the region that was done in 2021 did look at flooding and transportation impacts as well as heat and health, and there's some overlaps there. Some of the equity considerations, and again, these are probably obvious, but just have to do with the resiliency of transportation during weather extremes. For example, the accessibility to public transportation during times of high heat that could include, you know, protected walkways and shading and shelters along that, but also opportunities just to increase community cohesion with ownership of and connection to transportation systems that keep things moving and keep people connected during times of extreme weather. But just a reference to the climate action plan for the region that might have some ideas that could be useful as you go to make these connections.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Edith.
Any other comments from the committee on these linkages from transportation resilience to other potential interventions? Go ahead, Kate.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't realize the color changed. So for this next question, you know, again, at the July meeting, I think when I ask a question about, you know, what else within resilience could we be looking at, we heard from you the importance of local government and community organizations in providing resources to build resilience. I guess specifically, we were curious to hear what CMAP can do to support efforts by your organization to build resilience. If there's anything that comes to mind that we should be aware of right now.
So Oak Park right now is pretty focused, has included the 30 by 30 goals within its Climate Ready Oak Park commitments. And so I would say that's our primary resilience focus, is trying to convert or protect land for biodiversity. At the same time, climate mitigation is so top of mind because it has, I mean, they both have timelines on them, right? But climate action, I think, has been talked about longer. So I would say providing, I hesitate to say toolkits because I know everybody, you know, rolls eyes at toolkits. But honestly, for Oak Park, I think having something out of the box that we could link into, especially a regional program, would be really useful.
Thanks for that, Marcella.
It looks like Martha has their hand up.
So every year when we develop our capital improvement program, you know, we're looking 5 to 10 years out in our CIP, and it would be really great. I know that I'm plugged into some listservs that come across my email with possible grant opportunities or funding mechanisms for some of these bigger projects that we may have. But I don't know that everyone plugs into those opportunities to get that information. And so when CMAP hears about some of these funding opportunities, it would be great if you can send those out to the membership. Then we can use those as we look at our projects, not only for that year, but it may be a grant we never knew about that's offered annually, and it would be an opportunity for us to look in future years out. You know, funding, everybody knows it's always the issue, right?
Sorry, absolutely, Martha. And I do think CMAP's trying to do this through our climate newsletter. I imagine all committee members are subscribed. If you haven't, please go to our website and subscribe, because we are including those types of updates on that. But we could do more to bring it to everyone's attention, as opposed to a newsletter.
It looks like Committee Member Mansour has his hand up.
Hi, thank you. This is more of a statement, Kate. I owe you an email, you and Nora and Kelsey. So apologies for that late response. But I just wanted to state that CMAP is also helping the city of Chicago by joining our heat vulnerability index group and working together. I think it was a great collaboration to add them along with city staff, researchers, and medical professionals working on this issue. So if it helps motivate others to collaborate with CMAP, I think that the data that you collect and the researchers you have are very complementary to what we're trying to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Yes, Edith.
Just a quick thought on community resources for building resilience. Municipalities have newsletters which reach everyone, and it's just a terrific way to share information. So take advantage of that with like drop-in articles and such, just to help get information out and help communities build an ethic and support resiliency efforts, whether it's mild inconvenience or whether it's suggested adaptations in behavior. To assure that people can still get around regardless of what's going on with extreme weather.
Great, thank you for that.
I wonder if there's an aspect of, in response to this question, but also in response to the stakeholder question before, about how impacts or delays or effects of extreme weather and climate change that we're seeing can be more efficiently communicated to users. Because I think when it's being prioritized for funding resources, sort of in the CIP example that Martha gave, you know, it may not always be, those connections may not be made to, well, the consistent flooding in the viaduct that's on my primary way to drive to work or my bus route to work, and I don't know exactly how this fits into CMAP's work on this, but that as a more direct linkage to important stakeholders, but also users towards with an eye towards future funding and future support could be explored and as part of this.
Yeah, what that makes me think about is, how our engagement strategy can really help to collect those stories of how flooding and extreme heat and extreme weather in general is really impacting um, people's everyday lives. And so that if we can then connect those stories to especially some of these priority improvement areas, but just the need for investments and policy changes to support building resilience in general, I think that can be very powerful.
There's some terrific, new tools for notifications that we get from different agencies that we work with, MWRDs here, but CTA and others. When there's some loss or delay or impacted service, and yet that connection to climate and the sort of quantification of impact to, how many hours lost, how many hours delayed, how many users impacted, how many routes because of, this, and some of that becomes a little bit, for the scientists on the call, the ability to make those attributional statements can become somewhat nerve-wracking, but I think in general, once you sort of aggregate and quantify or quantify and aggregate, then you can start to make some of those linkages more directly, and CMAP could be helpful in that regard.
Yeah, I think this project does give us an opportunity to look at that more closely. And certainly we're interested in continuing. I think this can be a continuing discussion with the committee, is our communication around this work and the importance of it, and really ultimately to help drive action.
Thank you. Oh, here we go. So the last question here, I'll just read it, Kate, sorry. What aspects of our of CMAP's resilience program do you want to further discuss as we plan for the next few years of work?
Nothing like ending with a very broad question.
I'm ready for committee members to jump in with their extreme heat and heat risk discussion that we had from a previous meeting.
So going back to my biodiversity thing, I think that would be something that is starting to be talked about, that probably fits more naturally in here than climate work.
Great.
Go ahead, Martha.
I just wanted to make a comment and thank you for all the work that you do, because all of it has been really helpful to me here as I bring the message of climate resilience and things like that back to our senior staff and board. And so I really appreciate all the work you do. And I'm looking forward to working with you guys more about it in the future. I like the idea of maybe framing the conversation toward climate resilience instead of climate change, because there are people that are still opposed to climate change and the whole idea behind that, which is kind of hard for us to imagine. But I do appreciate all of it. We're going to be looking at some bigger stormwater infrastructure improvements, especially in one of our older manufacturing areas in Schaumburg, to help with some flooding that's down there. So I'll be looking forward to any stormwater information and guidance you can provide in the future. That'd be great.
Absolutely, we're happy to do so. And thanks for that comment about framing the conversation around climate resilience.
Yeah, and on this question, I would just add that as we mentioned, we'll be talking about resilience again throughout the year, but particularly at the July meeting. So if there is work that you think that you've heard CMAP is working on, or that you think should be priorities going forward, that you want to discuss in greater depth, feel free to flag it now or in some of the conversations we have between now and July. But think about what other related topics you think should come before the committee. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. With that in mind, you've gotten me thinking about really climate resilience and adaptation is about adding more information and a changed context for our future planning. And so this is more of a general comment than a question or request for something for CMAP to work on, but maybe in queuing up the resilience conversation at our future meeting. What information for those of us that are in these sort of future planning discussions with a transportation department or buildings or fleet management, whatever it is, would be useful, would be helpful, and would be something that can be developed at a regional level. So CMAP's purview to then be made accessible to us to inform the future planning that we're engaging to try to sort of affect a climate informed planning process. I think that's sometimes if you haven't, sort of tried to pick apart your planning process, whether it's budget or to then ask a question about, well, what climate information do I need? What future fuel costs? What future demographic? Those kinds of future forecasts could then inform the planning process. And how is it climate impacted and affected? So that's more of a kind of a thought or a comment or a process question, but maybe that plants a seed to then inform the resilience discussion we'll have in the future. Okay, well, I think, Kate, anything else?
That's all. Thank you all for the helpful feedback. I really appreciate it.
And with that, I think we're going to move on to agenda item 5.0, which is the committee member updates. I don't think we received any member updates, Brian or Jamie, in advance of the meeting. But if any of the committee members do have an update they want to share, this is a good chance. Go ahead, Marcella.
So last night, Oak Park's board gave staff direction to move forward with an all-electric requirement for new construction, as well as a benchmarking policy.
Congratulations. Any other updates from committee members? Okay, hearing none. Is there other new business, item 6.0, to come before the committee? If none, we're going to move on to the next item, which is 7.0, which is the public comment. I did see a few comments in the chat. Brian, I don't know if you want to address those.
Sure, we can start with what came in the chat, and thanks to everyone for participating in the conversation today. Many of these comments have already been sort of addressed through the conversation, but a couple things to note. Bob Israel, I think, has left the call, so I'll include his comments. He noted that in the last meeting, he spoke of the idea of sponsoring municipalities to generate their own CAPs, climate action plans, in support of the regional CAP. He notes that Northbrook has beat their estimates by creating their CAP, and he asked if anyone can help him see if there are avenues through this group to do this. So if anyone would like to reach out to Bob, please, you can get in touch with us and we can connect you. I know this is also an idea that's come up in some of CMAP's conversations. And then I think the others, Edith provided a link to the adaptation section of the regional CAP, starting on page 44. That's relevant to Kate's presentation. And Jenny Vanna from CMAP provided some context on our distribution list, our climate newsletters, noted that you all are subscribed to our climate newsletter, and that the team is looking for other opportunities that they can share with you, and that we do try to leverage our partners' resources. So thank you all. Outside of the chat, we did get a couple of public comments submitted. from a couple of members of the public. Garland Armstrong asked us to mention that we should make sure that the ADA community will get involved in climate work to make sure that people with disabilities like breathing problems can live life to the fullest. Sometimes people don't understand the topic, so it is important to use translators, including for American Sign Language. And Heather Armstrong submitted that Illinois needs a bottle bill with 5 to 10 cent refunds for recycling glass and plastic bottles. Deposits and refunds would help make sure people do not litter, including in Lake Michigan. So thank you to Garland and Heather for submitting those comments.
Thank you, Brian. If there's no other public comment, the next agenda item is 8.0, our next meeting. We will meet Tuesday, April 25th, 2023 at 9 a.m. Currently, I think it's scheduled to be remote, but I suppose that could change. So just letting folks know that we may be transitioning to in-person at some time throughout the year. I think we discussed that at our previous meeting. Next agenda item 9.0 is adjourn. So if there's no other business before the committee, maybe I'll just double check. Marcel, I see your hand still up. That's, I think, just a remnant. Yep. Thank you. If there's no other business, we are adjourned. Thank you. Have a terrific rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.